You've felt it before you had a name for it. The sense that paying attention to something changes it. The relationship you watched too closely until it curdled. The fear you kept checking on until it grew teeth. You called it bad luck, or bad timing, or a bad frequency. In 1998, physicists proved you were closer to right than you knew, and further off than the wellness industry ever told you. They found that the simple act of measurement, of paying attention to a particle, changes what that particle does. Not metaphorically, measurably, repeatably. This isn't the "your consciousness creates your reality" story. That version got sold to you. In the next few minutes, you're going to see the actual experiment, what physicists really mean by observation, and the one real adjustment it makes to how you live your Wednesday. I need to admit something that still slightly embarrasses me. There was a period a few years back when I fell hard for the version of quantum physics you find in documentaries with dramatic music and slow-motion shots of galaxies. I watched the videos. I read the books with titles that promised to unlock the secret architecture of reality. I told people with total sincerity that if I just held the right vibration, reality would rearrange itself to match it. I wasn't stupid. I was hungry. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand that the hunger was real, even when the explanation I found for it wasn't. I remember the specific video that started it for me, an editor's dramatic cut of a physicist explaining wave-particle duality, laid over shots of nebulae and slow orchestral music, ending on a caption that said something like, "Your consciousness creates your reality." I watched it 4 times in a row. I felt something click into place that I badly wanted to be true, because at the time I was in a period of my life where almost nothing felt within my control, and here was a video telling me that the deepest layer of physical reality was, in fact, entirely within my control, if only I learned to hold the right internal state. I built an entire private practice around that caption. Morning visualization. A specific breathing pattern, I was told, would raise my vibration. A running mental tally of how convinced I felt on any given day, as if conviction itself were the missing ingredient in an otherwise correct recipe. And for a while, it felt like it was working in the loose, retroactive way these things always feel like they're working. Good things happened, and I credited the practice. Bad things happened, and I quietly decided I must not have believed hard enough. If any of that sounds familiar, the running tally, the private scorecard of how hard you believe today, you're not the only one keeping it, and you're not keeping it because you're careless. You're keeping it because somewhere you were told belief was a performance you could get graded on, and nobody ever told you the grading system itself was rigged from the start. That second part is the part I want to slow down on, because it's the tell. Any system where failure is always your fault for not believing correctly and success is always proof the system works, isn't actually a system you can test. It's a closed loop, dressed up as physics, that can never be wrong in its own eyes. Looking back, what I actually wanted wasn't a frequency. I wanted permission to believe my situation could change without having to do the slow, unglamorous work of examining why I kept ending up in the same version of it. The frequency language offered a shortcut around that examination, and I took it gladly, for longer than I'm proud of. It's worth naming that honestly here, because if any part of what I'm describing sounds familiar, you're not gullible for having wanted the shortcut. You're human. The shortcut is seductive precisely because the real work is genuinely harder. What actually happened is that I eventually opened one of the original physics papers behind all of it. Not a summary, not a documentary transcript, the actual research, and felt something close to grief, not because the science was boring, because it was better than the myth. Stranger, more disciplined, and far more demanding of me than just raise your vibration had ever been. The myth had let me stay passive, waiting for a frequency to arrive and do the work for me. The actual physics did something else entirely. It handed the responsibility straight back to the one place I'd been avoiding it, my own attention. Here's what I mean by responsibility, and I want to be precise instead of poetic about it. In the version of this idea sold by most wellness content, the universe listens to your frequency the way a genie listens to a wish, passively, waiting, ready to comply the moment you get the incantation right. That version requires nothing hard from you except sincerity and repetition. Say the affirmation enough times, hold the feeling long enough, and the frequency supposedly does the rest. The actual mechanism, once you strip the marketing off it, requires something much less comfortable. Sustained, disciplined attention to what you're actually perceiving, moment to moment, instead of what you assume you're perceiving out of habit. That's not a chant. That's not a vibration you can buy on a meditation app. It's closer to a practice of radical honesty about where your attention has been living without your consent. I want to tell you exactly what changed for me the day I understood the difference, because it wasn't dramatic, and that itself is the point. I didn't feel a surge of energy. I didn't have a vision. I sat with the actual mechanics of the double-slit experiment, the one most people have heard referenced, but never actually seen explained properly, and realized that what physicists mean by observation has almost nothing in common with what a meditation app means by it. And once I understood the real definition, I couldn't unsee how badly I'd been misapplying the borrowed one to my own life. That's not a small correction. It's the difference between waiting for reality to notice you and understanding precisely what noticing actually does. I think about how differently I would have spent those years if someone had handed me the real version instead of the borrowed one. Not because the real version is more comforting. It's actually less comforting in the short term because it doesn't let you outsource the work to a frequency. But it's more honest, and honesty, it turns out, is a far more durable foundation to build a life on than a caption over a nebula ever was. So the real question underneath all the frequency language was never, how do I vibrate at the right level to attract what I want? That question assumes a universe that works like a vending machine, responding to the correct combination of feeling and intention. The real question is stranger and considerably more grounded. What does it actually mean mechanically for observation to change an outcome? And if that's true at the smallest scale physics can measure, what does it suggest about the scale you actually live at, the scale of your attention, your habits, your unexamined defaults? That explains why the myth felt so seductive. It borrowed real, strange, well-documented physics and translated it into a promise no physicist would ever make. It doesn't yet explain what the physics itself actually says, in its own words, without the translation. And that requires going back to the room where it was first measured and staying there long enough to let the actual, unglamorous mechanics do the explaining instead of the highlight reel. There's a particular kind of person this video is for, and if you've made it this far, you probably already suspect you're one of them. You're not someone who needs convincing that reality is stranger than it looks. You already sense that, which is exactly why the frequency version appealed to you in the first place. What you actually need isn't more strangeness. It's the real version of the strangeness, precise enough to hold weight instead of the vague version that collapses the second someone asks a specific question about it. Picture the actual setup, because the phrase double-slit experiment gets thrown around so often in wellness content that most people who reference it have never actually pictured what's happening inside it, and the version they're imagining is usually wrong in a way that matters. A barrier with two thin parallel slits cut into it, close together, each one barely wider than the wavelength of the particle being fired at it. Behind the barrier, a screen, and in the earliest versions, a photographic plate. In modern versions, a digital detector array that records where particles land, point by point, over time. In front of it, a source firing individual particles, electrons or photons of light, one at a time, not in a stream, not in a burst, one single solitary particle at a time, each one arriving at the barrier long after the previous one has already been recorded, with no possible way for it to interact with or be influenced by particles that came before it. If those particles behaved the way a common-sense picture of tiny solid objects would suggest, you'd expect two bands on the screen behind the barrier, one lined up with each slit, the simple shadow pattern of things passing through two gaps. That's not what happens. What actually shows up on the screen, over thousands of individual particles fired one by one, is an interference pattern, alternating bands of high and low probability, the exact signature you'd expect from two overlapping waves, not two streams of separate particles. Each individual particle, fired alone with no other particle anywhere near it, behaves as though it passed through both slits at once and interfered with itself. That result alone, first observed in various forms across the early 20th century, was strange enough to unsettle physicists who had built their careers on a much tidier picture of the universe. A picture where things were either particles, small and localized, or waves spread out and overlapping, but never under any circumstances both. Richard Feynman, decades later, would call this the central mystery of quantum mechanics, the one experiment that contains, in his words, the whole of the strangeness. Not because the math was hard to do, but because no one has ever found a way to make the result feel intuitive, no matter how many times it's explained. It's worth pausing on why that intuition gap matters here specifically. Most spiritual reinterpretations of quantum physics exploit exactly this gap, the fact that even physicists admit the result doesn't feel intuitive, as an opening to insert whatever explanation feels satisfying, regardless of whether it's the one the mathematics actually supports. Nobody really understands it, so my explanation is as good as any is a seductive line of reasoning, and it's also completely backwards. The fact that a result is counterintuitive doesn't mean any interpretation is equally valid. It means the correct interpretation requires more discipline to hold on to, not less. Let it sit for a moment exactly how strange this is, because it's easy to nod along with the sentence without absorbing what it actually claims. A single particle alone, with nothing else nearby to interfere with, somehow produces a pattern on the far screen that can only be explained if it passed through both slits simultaneously and interfered with its own possible paths, as though, until it landed, it hadn't yet decided which way it had gone, and in some sense had gone both ways at once. Beat. But the part that actually matters for this video isn't the pattern itself. It's what happens the moment someone in the room decides to look. Here's where it gets almost impossible to say out loud without sounding like you're making it up. If you place a detector at the slits, a way to determine, particle by particle, which slit each one actually goes through, the interference pattern vanishes immediately, completely. The particles stop behaving like an overlapping wave and start behaving exactly like the simple common-sense picture. Two clean bands, one behind each slit, as if the particles had been ordinary tiny objects the entire time. Nothing about the source changed. Nothing about the barrier changed. The only variable that changed was whether the path information, which slit each particle used, was recorded anywhere, by anything at all. This is the part worth being extremely careful about, because it's exactly where the wellness version of this story goes wrong, and where you deserve better than the version built for engagement metrics. It is tempting, almost irresistible to say, the particle knew it was being watched and stopped there, letting your imagination fill the rest in with something that sounds like consciousness reaching directly into matter. That is not what physicists mean, and it's worth naming the actual explanation plainly, because it's not less interesting, it's more interesting. What collapses the interference pattern isn't a mind noticing something, it's interaction. Any physical interaction that extracts which path information from the system, whether or not any human being ever looks at the result afterward. A detector left running, recording data nobody ever reviews, still destroys the interference pattern. A conscious observer glancing at a screen isn't required. What's required is a physical measurement, an entanglement between the particle and something, a detector, another particle, any system capable of recording the information that, in principle, makes the path knowable. There's a specific variant of this experiment, sometimes called the delayed choice or quantum eraser version, that makes this even stranger and even more precise. In these setups, researchers can record the which path information and then afterward erase it, scramble the recorded data so the path is no longer knowable even in principle, and the interference pattern reappears in the statistics even though nothing about the particles themselves was touched a second time. What changed was purely whether the information remained knowable anywhere in the universe, not whether a person happened to check it. That single detail is usually the piece missing from the wellness version of this story, and it's the piece that makes the real explanation more interesting than the myth, not less. And before you file this away as something that only happens to electrons in a lab 3,000 miles from your life, think about the last time you decided not to check a message, on purpose, just to keep a possibility open a little longer. The good news that might be waiting. The reply that might change everything. You already know instinctively that leaving something unmeasured feels different than measuring it and finding out it's fine. That instinct isn't superstition. It's you, without any physics vocabulary for it, already sensing that some things genuinely stay open until you look. This is the core of what's known as the Copenhagen interpretation, developed in the 1920s, largely through the work of Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, and it's worth stating exactly what it claims rather than what popular culture later did with it. The Copenhagen interpretation holds that a quantum system exists in a range of possibilities, described mathematically as a superposition, until it interacts with a measuring system, at which point one specific outcome is realized. It does not claim that human consciousness specifically is the special ingredient that causes this. It claims that measurement, physical interaction of a particular kind, does. It's worth being upfront that Copenhagen isn't the only serious interpretation physicists hold today. Some, following physicist Hugh Everett's 1957 proposal, favor the many worlds interpretation, which avoids collapse altogether by suggesting every possible outcome actually happens in branching, non-interacting versions of reality. Physicists still genuinely disagree about which picture is correct, and that disagreement is worth naming honestly rather than glossing over, because this video isn't interested in borrowing physics authority while hiding its open questions. What isn't in serious dispute across every major interpretation is the experimental result itself. What you can predict and measure behaves exactly as described here, whichever underlying picture you prefer. Bohr and Einstein famously debated this point for years, in person and in letters, neither one ever fully convincing the other. Einstein found the idea that reality remained genuinely undetermined until measured deeply uncomfortable. He's the one who said in a moment of frustration that God does not play dice with the universe. Bohr's reported response was, essentially, that it wasn't Einstein's place to tell God what to do with the dice. That exchange matters here because it shows you these weren't fringe thinkers reaching for mysticism. These were two of the most rigorous minds of the 20th century, disagreeing sharply about what the math actually meant, precisely because the implications were this strange, even to the people who understood the equations perfectly. Worth pausing on this before moving forward. Even Einstein wanted certainty badly enough to argue against his own field's best evidence. If the smartest person in the room can want an answer to be settled before it actually is, it's worth asking honestly how often you do the same thing in your own life, deciding a situation is resolved one way or the other simply because the not knowing was harder to sit with than a wrong answer would have been. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it's the hinge the rest of this video turns on. Later physicists, working through what's called decoherence theory from the 1970s onward, filled in even more of the picture, showing how a quantum system's delicate superposition breaks down naturally through interaction with its environment, countless tiny, unavoidable exchanges with surrounding particles, long before any human observer ever enters the picture at all. Decoherence explains, in mechanical terms, why the strange quantum behavior of individual particles doesn't show up in the ordinary, solid, reliable world you and I move through every day. Your body, this room, the chair under you. All of it is constantly interacting with its environment in ways that collapse quantum possibilities into definite outcomes trillions of times a second, with or without anyone deliberately watching. This matters because it closes off the most common misreading before it can even start. If observation literally meant a conscious mind paying attention, then anything unobserved by a person, a rock at the bottom of the ocean, an electron in a distant star, would somehow remain undetermined until a human happened to glance at it, which is obviously absurd and isn't what any serious physicist has ever claimed. Decoherence shows that the universe is doing this collapsing constantly, mechanically everywhere, independent of anyone's awareness. Consciousness isn't the mechanism, interaction is, and once you understand that distinction clearly, the temptation to oversell this into your mind literally builds the physical world evaporates, while the far stranger, better supported version stays fully intact. It's worth sitting with why the mechanical version is actually the more remarkable one, not the consolation prize. A universe where your mind directly rearranges matter through wishing would, in a strange way, be a smaller universe, one that revolves around a single species' attention. A universe where possibility genuinely stays open at every scale, constantly resolving through interaction, whether or not anyone is watching, and where your own attention is simply one particular, especially interesting instance of that general process, is a stranger and more interesting claim, even though it asks less of physical reality and more of you. So no, this doesn't prove that thinking hard about a parking spot makes one appear. It doesn't prove that consciousness reaches out into the world and rearranges matter through intention alone. Be honest about what it does and doesn't establish, because the honest version is still remarkable. It proves that at the most fundamental scale we can currently measure, a system's possibilities remain genuinely open, genuinely undetermined, until some form of interaction resolves them into one actual outcome, and that the presence or absence of that interaction is, in a very real and experimentally verified sense, decisive. Now hold that finding next to your own experience for a second, because this is where physics stops being a story about particles and starts being a story about you. You are not a physicist running detectors on electrons, but you are every single day running something structurally similar on your own experience, deciding, mostly unconsciously, which parts of an ambiguous moment you're going to register, measure, and treat as what happened, and which parts pass through unrecorded, undetermined, never collapsed into a fact you carry forward. It's worth being honest about the limits of this comparison before going further, because overclaiming it would put this video in exactly the category it's trying to correct. Electrons and photons are not making choices. They don't have preferences about which slit to pass through, and nothing in this experiment suggests they do. The comparison isn't, your mind works exactly like a particle. The comparison is narrower and, in a way, more useful. Both systems demonstrate that genuine, unresolved possibility can exist right up until an interaction forces a specific outcome. And in your case, unlike the electrons, you actually get to notice which interactions you're the one initiating. That validates the paradox from block 1. Observation genuinely does change outcomes at the level physics can measure. But it opens something considerably harder to sit with, because if that's true at the scale of particles, what exactly is your own attention doing all day, every day, to the far more ambiguous, far more interpretable material of your actual life? Here's where this stops being about electrons and starts being about your actual Wednesday. Think about the last time you walked into a room already braced for tension, a family gathering, a meeting with a manager who's been distant lately, a conversation you'd been dreading. You weren't neutral going in. You were, in effect, running a detector, already primed for a specific kind of path information, evidence of coldness, evidence of disappointment, evidence that confirms the story you walked in with. And notice what happens next. A slightly flat tone of voice, one that could mean nothing more than someone being tired, gets measured and recorded as coldness. A pause before someone answers, one that could simply be someone thinking, gets measured and recorded as hesitation, as doubt, as the beginning of the bad news you were already expecting. None of that is you imagining things out of nowhere. The ambiguous moment genuinely was ambiguous. It genuinely could have gone either way, the way a particle genuinely can be found at more than one location before it's measured. But your attention functioned exactly like the detector at the slits. The moment it extracted a specific reading, the ambiguity collapsed into one fixed version, and that version became, for you, simply what happened, indistinguishable afterward from objective fact. It's worth noticing how quickly the collapsed version gets treated, as if it had always been the only possibility. You rarely walk away from one of these moments thinking, I made a reading, and it might have been wrong. You walk away thinking, that's what happened. Full stop, with all the certainty of a fact you observed directly, rather than a probability you resolve through your own particular way of looking. That's not a character flaw. It's simply what measurement does. Collapse a range of possibilities into one outcome so convincingly that the other possibilities disappear from memory entirely, as if they'd never been live options at all. This is the actual mechanism hiding underneath every piece of vague spiritual language about your frequency attracting your reality. It was never about vibration in the literal physical sense. No wellness influencer has ever produced a device that measures the hertz of a feeling. What's real and measurable in your own life, if you're honest with yourself, is this. Your attention is constantly running detectors on an ambiguous stream of raw experience, and every single detector reading collapses a range of possible interpretations down into one specific remembered fact. which then becomes part of the evidence you use to run the next detector. It's worth being clear about why vibration became the go-to word in the first place, since the borrowed language isn't entirely arbitrary. Frequency is a real physical concept, and it's genuinely true that everything, including your own neural activity, involves oscillation at some level. But borrowing a real word from physics doesn't make the metaphorical claim built on top of it true. The actual bridge between quantum mechanics and your daily experience was never vibration. It was measurement, the decision, made constantly and mostly unconsciously, about which version of an ambiguous moment gets to become your recorded reality. Watch how this compounds. You collapse one ambiguous tone of voice into, "He's annoyed with me," and that single collapsed data point becomes part of the background field the next ambiguous moment gets measured against. Over weeks, over years, you're not perceiving your relationships freshly each day. You're running detectors that have been pre-calibrated by every previous measurement, and pre-calibrated detectors don't measure neutrally. They measure in a way that confirms their own prior settings again and again, with what feels like devastating consistency. Here's the part that reframes the entire manifestation conversation. If you let it, you cannot by wishing make a coin land on a specific side before it's flipped. That was never the promise physics actually makes, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But you have enormous, well-documented influence over which parts of your own ambiguous, constantly flipping daily experience you extract and lock in as data. Which tone of voice, which pause, which unanswered text, which flicker of good news you allow to register as real instead of immediately scanning past it for the catch. There's a compounding effect here worth naming directly, because it explains why this feels so much harder to shift the longer you've been running the same detector. Each collapsed measurement doesn't just sit there neutrally, filed away. It becomes part of the calibration for the next detector reading, which becomes part of the calibration for the one after that, until you're not measuring the present moment at all. You're measuring a present moment that's been preloaded with the accumulated weight of every similar moment you've already collapsed the same way. 10 years of collapsing ambiguous silences into rejection doesn't just give you 10 data points. It gives you a detector so finely tuned to find rejection that an actual neutral silence barely stands a chance of registering as anything else. What's actually within your control is something far more modest than bending the wave function of the universe to your will, which measurements you take, and how many times a day you take them. Here's a version of this that has nothing to do with tension or fear at all, because it's worth seeing that the mechanism runs both directions. Think about the last time you were mildly, pleasantly surprised. A stranger held a door. A colleague mentioned something you'd said weeks earlier and clearly remembered it. A small piece of good news arrived out of nowhere. If you're someone whose detector is calibrated toward threat, notice how quickly that moment gets measured as an anomaly, a fluke, something to be mildly grateful for, and then move past quickly, rather than something to actually register as data about how your life tends to go. The detector didn't just miss the good news, it actively classified it as noise, unworthy of being counted as a real measurement, while an equally ambiguous piece of bad news would have been logged immediately, in detail, and remembered for weeks. Think about how often you run the detector for threat compared to how often you run it for safety, in an identical ambiguous situation. Think about how many good things happened to you this week that you didn't stop long enough to measure, that stayed for you unresolved, unregistered, never collapsed into something good actually happened, simply because you didn't hold your attention there long enough for the measurement to complete. This is where most people, once they understand this, make the exact same mistake I made for a while, which is trying to force every measurement toward relentless positivity, forcibly interpreting every ambiguous moment as good news, which is just running a different, equally rigid detector instead of an honest one. That's not what this mechanism is asking of you. A rigged detector isn't more accurate just because it's rigged toward something pleasant. What it's actually asking is slower and considerably more demanding. Noticing that you're running a detector at all, in the moment you're running it, before the measurement locks in and becomes another permanent brick in the wall of how things always go for me. Consider how this shows up at work specifically, because it's one of the places the pattern hides best, disguised as professionalism. Your manager schedules an unexpected one-on-one, and before the meeting even starts, you've already run the detector, replaying every recent piece of feedback, scanning for what you might be about to be told is wrong. The meeting turns out to be about a project timeline. Nothing about you personally was ever in question. But notice what happened in the 20 minutes before it started. You took a measurement based on old entangled data from some prior job or some prior disappointment and treated the collapsed result as fact, well before any actual information existed to justify it. So if changing your frequency was never the real lever, if the actual lever is something closer to which measurements you take and how consciously you take them, what's the deeper mechanism that decides, underneath your awareness, which detector gets switched on in any given moment, before you've had a chance to choose it deliberately? This is the layer most people never reach, because it requires looking at something even stranger than the double-slit experiment, and being willing to hold a metaphor carefully instead of collapsing it into a claim physics never made. In 1935, Albert Einstein, along with physicists Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper describing what's now known as the EPR paradox, a thought experiment designed, ironically, to prove that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, because it seemed to require something Einstein found deeply uncomfortable: two particles once linked, remaining correlated with each other no matter how far apart they travel, such that measuring one instantly determines the corresponding property of the other, regardless of distance. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance and meant it as a criticism, a flaw he expected future physics to eventually resolve away. It's worth appreciating how strange it is that one of the greatest physicists in history looked at this implication and concluded it must be a mistake, rather than a discovery. That instinct, the sense that reality simply couldn't work this way, that there had to be some hidden, sensible explanation underneath the strangeness, is worth recognizing, because it's the exact same instinct that makes most people dismiss the deeper implications of their own unresolved beliefs. Surely, we tell ourselves, there's a simpler explanation for why this keeps happening. Surely it isn't really still connected to something that far back. Einstein's instinct here, brilliant as he was, turned out to be wrong. It wasn't resolved away. Decades later, through experiments testing what are called Bell inequalities, named for physicist John Stuart Bell, who in 1964 devised a mathematical way to actually test whether Einstein's suspicion was correct. Physicists confirmed, through a long series of increasingly rigorous experiments running from the 1970s into the 2010s, that entanglement is real. Two particles once entangled do remain correlated in a way that can't be explained by any hidden, pre-existing local property they secretly carried with them the whole time. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics went to three researchers, Alain Aspect, John Clauser and Anton Zeilinger, specifically for the experiments that closed the remaining loopholes and confirmed this beyond reasonable doubt. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't mean, because entanglement is arguably the single most misused concept in the entire spiritual physics genre. It does not mean information travels faster than light. That would violate relativity. And nothing in the confirmed experiments shows that. It does not mean two people who love each other are quantum entangled in some literal physical sense the moment they think of each other. What it means, carefully stated, is that the particle's properties remain undetermined and correlated as a single system until measurement, not independent, not separate, until something resolves that state. Stay with me here, because this is where it stops being about labs in Vienna and starts being about you again. You already know what it feels like to carry a correlation like that. A decision sitting in front of you today, take the leap, send the message, ask for the raise, that somehow still answers to a room you left years ago, a person who isn't even in your life anymore, a version of you that made one measurement once and never checked whether it still held. Here is the metaphor, offered as a metaphor, not a physical claim. Think of an old unexamined belief, something installed in you years ago, in a specific room, at a specific age, by a specific disappointment, as something that stays correlated with your present moment decisions, even across enormous distance in time, until it's actually brought into conscious awareness and measured directly. It doesn't have to be looked at daily to keep exerting its pull. It sits unresolved entangled with choices you're making right now that seem on the surface to have nothing to do with it. The hesitation before you send the email, the flinch before you say what you actually want out loud, correlated at a distance with an old measurement you never consciously took, from a state you never actually collapsed into something examined and understood. Think about how strange this actually is when you say it plainly. A decision you're making today about a completely unrelated situation with completely different people in a completely different context can still be shaped by an old, unresolved measurement from a room you haven't stood in for 15 years. The same way an entangled particle on one side of a laboratory responds to what happens to its partner on the other side, correlated across a distance that, by any ordinary account, should make them independent of each other. You are, in this narrow but genuinely useful sense, still entangled with rooms you left a long time ago, until you actually go back and take the measurement you never took the first time. This is where decoherence becomes more than physics vocabulary and starts to describe something recognizably psychological, if you're willing to let the metaphor do real work instead of decorative work. In physics, decoherence is what happens when a fragile quantum superposition interacts with its environment enough times that it settles into one definite, stable state, indistinguishable afterward from ordinary classical reality. In a life, something structurally similar happens with belief. An old fear, an old vow, an old unexamined conclusion about what you deserve stays in a kind of psychic superposition, technically still open to revision, technically still just one interpretation among several possible ones, until it interacts again and again with enough confirming measurements that it hardens into something that no longer feels like an interpretation at all. It feels like simple, settled, classical fact. This is just how things are for me. The uncomfortable part of this metaphor, and the part worth sitting with rather than rushing past, is that the hardening isn't caused by one dramatic event in most cases. It's caused by thousands of small, forgettable, confirming interactions, the same way physical decoherence happens through countless tiny, unremarkable collisions rather than one single catastrophic one. Nobody sits you down and declares your fear officially true. It just accumulates enough small ambiguous confirmations, collapsed the same way each time, until revisiting it feels less like reconsidering an open question and more like denying something everyone, including you, already knows. Here's the mechanism, stated as plainly as I can manage after everything this video has covered. Every unexamined belief remains, in a real sense, unresolved, correlated with your present choices, exerting real influence without ever having been properly measured. And every time you let an ambiguous moment collapse automatically, without noticing you're the one running the detector, you're not taking a fresh measurement of your actual present. You're reconfirming an old one, recycling a correlation that formed a long time ago in a completely different context, under completely different conditions, and calling the result reality. Deliberately taking a fresh measurement, pausing on purpose before you let an ambiguous tone or an ambiguous silence collapse automatically into the old familiar interpretation, is not a metaphysical trick. It's closer to what a careful physicist does when they suspect their instrument might be miscalibrated. They don't just trust the old reading. They run the measurement again, cleanly, checking whether the result still holds under fresh conditions or whether it was only ever an artifact of a detector that needed recalibrating. This is the actual, unmarketed version of changing your frequency. It was never a vibration you could summon through repetition of a phrase. It's the far more demanding, far more available practice of catching the automatic measurement before it locks in, and asking, honestly, whether this specific moment, this specific silence, this specific flicker of good news actually contains the evidence you're about to record, or whether you're simply running an old entangled correlation one more time and calling it fresh data. There's a reason this feels almost impossible the first few times you try it, and it's worth naming so you don't mistake the difficulty for failure. Old, entangled correlations don't announce themselves as old. They arrive dressed as certainty, as instinct, as simply knowing how this situation is going to go, because they've had years, sometimes decades, to compound into something that no longer feels like an interpretation at all. Catching one in the act requires slowing down at exactly the moment your nervous system is most insistent that no slowing down is necessary, which is precisely why this is a practice, repeated in small moments, rather than a single insight you absorb once and carry with you automatically from then on. I want to stop explaining the physics for a second and just talk to you, because I think you already know which detector you've been running on autopilot. I think you know exactly which area of your life gets measured, again and again through the same old entangled correlation. The relationship you keep reading as one flat tone of voice away from ending, the project you keep measuring for the first sign of failure before it's even had a fair chance to show you anything. The version of yourself you keep collapsing into not enough every time an ambiguous silence gives you the smallest excuse to. You are not broken for running that detector. You built it, or it was built in you, for a reason that made sense once under conditions that were real at the time. It kept you prepared. It kept you from being blindsided. That's not nothing. Maybe it's the way you've stopped trusting good weeks, treating them as the calm before something inevitably goes wrong, so that you spend the good week half-braced instead of actually living inside it. Maybe it's a specific person whose every silence you've already pre-measured as distance, long before you've given the silence a real chance to mean something ordinary. Maybe it's simply the running measurement you take of yourself, first thing every morning before anything has actually happened yet, to justify it one way or the other. But it is costing you every fresh measurement you haven't taken since. Every ambiguous moment this year that could have gone a dozen different ways, and instead got collapsed, automatically, into the one interpretation the old detector was already calibrated to find. You don't have to fix this today. You just have to notice the next time you feel a familiar interpretation arriving fast, arriving before you've actually looked, that you're allowed to take the measurement again. That's a smaller ask than it sounds like, and it's worth saying plainly, because a lot of self-development content will tell you that noticing isn't enough, that you need a whole system, a whole overhaul. You don't. You need the pause, the single extra second between the ambiguous moment and the automatic reading. Everything else follows from that 1 second, repeated, more than it follows from any elaborate practice you'd have to remember to perform. Back to where we started, the experiment that shows observation changing outcomes, and the myth built on top of it that turned a precise, disciplined finding into a promise about frequencies and vibrations that no physicist ever made. Here's the one-sentence version of everything this video has actually been trying to say. The code was never a frequency you needed to find outside yourself. It's the discipline of noticing, again and again, which measurements you're taking of your own life, and taking them on purpose instead of on autopilot. And here's the layer I didn't tell you at the start, because it would have sounded like a smaller claim than the one you came here for. This was never about unlocking some hidden divine setting in the universe that responds to the right incantation. Some measurements you take honestly will still come back, showing something hard, something disappointing, something that doesn't resolve the way you hoped. That was never the promise, and it never needed to be, because the actual shift available to you isn't control over every outcome. It's the far more grounded power of taking the measurement freshly, honestly, instead of letting an old entangled correlation answer for you before you've even looked. There's a kind of quiet relief available in that reframe, if you let yourself feel it, instead of treating it as a letdown. You were never actually responsible for bending outcomes through sheer force of belief. That was an exhausting job description nobody should have handed you in the first place. What you're actually responsible for is much smaller, much more doable and much more honest. Staying present enough, often enough, to take the measurement fresh instead of on autopilot. That's what the physics was quietly pointing at the entire time, underneath every misapplied wellness slogan built on top of it. Not a universe waiting for your vibration. A universe and a mind, where genuine possibility stays open longer than you've been taught to believe, right up until the moment you decide, consciously or not, to measure it. Think about what actually changes if you carry only this much forward. The next time an ambiguous silence, an ambiguous tone, an ambiguous piece of news arrives, you notice the old detector reaching for its familiar reading, and instead of trusting it automatically, you give the moment 1 extra second to stay open before you decide what it means. That's the whole practice, in its smallest, most portable form, not a new vibration. 1 extra second of genuine measurement, taken on purpose, instead of an old one recycled out of habit. You were never waiting for the right frequency. You were the detector the whole time. If this video gave you language for something you'd sensed but couldn't quite explain, That's exactly what this channel exists to do every week. Subscribing isn't a favor to me. It's a private agreement with the version of you that's ready to take fresh measurements instead of trusting the old ones automatically. That's who this channel is built for. Comment: I choose to measure again. This Saturday, we go one layer further, into the idea that reality shifting isn't a metaphor at all, but an actual repeatable process. I'll see you there.